This position was only a temporary one. It was too extended. I only took it to avoid retiring suddenly behind the town and thus allowing the enemy to penetrate between that place and Severn, which Lieutenant General Despereau occupied with a battalion of the line, some partisans, and a few lancers. General Rodenburg was entrusted with the task of observing the Rhine on our rear and on the right. I had only been able to allow him a brigade, which I had left at South. Out of this, I was obliged to withdraw the 40th Regiment the moment the Austrians appeared. There only remained with him the 39th, whose 2nd Battalion formed the advanced posts, and the reserve. The 1st, a company of sappers and 8 pieces of cannon, composed the line of battle for more than half a league of ground. The situation, without being bad itself, had nothing particularly encouraging in it. The small town of Seltz, supported on the Rhine, is situated on the 2 banks of the Seltzbach. This river is pretty secure for about 400 yards, but farther up it is fordable everywhere, and the woods on its banks render the passage of it still more easy. On the other hand, I feared a landing which the enemy could easily effect behind the right, and to which I could make but a feeble opposition, whilst all my attention was wanted on the front, which, as I have said, extended to a great distance. In this alternative, General Rutenberg decided on keeping a watch on the Rhine only by means of patrols, and he sent a company to guard the forts from the mill at Selt at Niederam. He placed his artillery on a small eminence on the right bank to the left of the town, and what remained of his soldiers he sent forward to support the 2nd Battalion, which occupied the advanced posts in the wood. At 11 o'clock, the enemy, having assembled his masses, commenced the attack by a well-sustained fire of musketry, which he supported with 8 pieces of cannon. The opposition of our troops was obstinate, and for a long time was effectual, but at last this small advanced post was compelled to retreat into the wood. It maintained itself there with heroic courage and resisted for a long time the efforts of from 8,000 to 9,000 men, aided by a numerous artillery. In fine, after a few hours, the finest resistance, this handful of valiant troops retreated in the greatest order and rejoined the 1st Battalion. Emboldened by the success, our adversaries brought down their masses. They debouched by the main road and marched on Seltz, of which they thought to get possession without difficulty. We allowed them to come up under the fire of our batteries as soon as they could play. A tremendous discharge carried death into their ranks. Encouraged by their numbers, they nevertheless continued to advance, and the combat recommenced with more vigor than before, but constantly repelled by the valor of our soldiers and mowed down by the French artillery. The Austrians in the end gave way and retired in confusion into the wood. Their movements from that time became uncertain, and they had stated a long time which they should do. Our cannon continued to carry destruction into their ranks. Attack was not more dangerous than inaction. They again advanced and succeeded in getting possession of the part of the town situated on the left bank. But this triumph cost them dear. A few shells thrown into the houses of which they were in possession compelled them to leave them and to regain in a great hurry their first place of shelter. Our batteries fired with increased fury, and the fugitives suffered an immense loss. This was not the only attack in which they failed. At the commencement of the action, they had advanced by the main road from Weissenberg to Hagenau to Surberg, which was occupied by a battalion of the 18th under the command of Colonel Varol. This village was valiantly defended for more than 2 hours. The enemy could not penetrate into it, but they at last brought up forces so considerable that under the apprehension of seeing the position turn, General Albert ordered it to be evacuated. Our soldiers withdrew behind the Saar, where they joined the remainder of the regiment. Attacked in this position by some chosen troops of the Austrian army, they remained immovable, wearied with so many fruitless attacks, and convinced that they could not succeed in forcing men who appeared determined to die at their post, nor in getting possession of the avenues of the forest. The Allies at last decided on retreating. We had 300 men killed and wounded. The Austrians, by their own account, had lost 2,000 men and had 2 pieces of cannon dismounted. Our troops had scarcely taken a few hours' rest when I was obliged to put them again on their march. The Allied army of the Upper Rhine was advancing on Strasbourg. I'd received this news during the action. I had not a moment to lose. I marched immediately towards that place, and the result has shown whether this measure was proper. Chapter 57. It was during this retreat that the soldiers heard of the disastrous Battle of Waterloo and the Emperor's abdication, which, to that moment, I had carefully concealed from them. These events produced an universal discouragement, and desertion soon found its way among them. Fatal projects entered into the minds even of those who were least carried away by passion. Excited by malevolence, some wished to return to their homes. Others proposed to throw themselves as partisans into the Vosges. I was immediately informed of these intentions. I directly foresaw what terrible consequences they might produce. I issued an order of the day. It succeeded. Their minds were tranquilized, but it was not long before anxiety revived. When we reached Hagenau, the blank regiment, formerly so illustrious, loudly proclaimed the design of quitting the army and of repairing with its artillery into the mountains. The cannon were already harnessed, and one battalion had taken up its arms. I was informed of it. I rushed to the spot. I took in my hand the eagle of the rebels, and placing myself in the midst of them, "Soldiers," I cried, "I learned that it is proposed among you to desert us. In an hour's time we shall fight. Do you wish the Austrians to think that you have fled from the field of honor? Let the brave swear never to quit their eagles or their general-in-chief. I grant permission to the cowards to depart." At these words, all exclaimed, "Long live Rapp! Long live our general!" Everyone swore to die by his standard, and tranquility was restored. We immediately began our march and reached the Suffel, 2 leagues in advance of Strasbourg. The 15th Division had its right on the River Ill, its center at Hohenheim, its left at Suffelsweiersheim, and extended to the road from Brunt. The 16th occupied Lampertine, Muldelsheim, the 3 villages of Hausbergen, with its left resting on the road from Severn. Lastly, the 17th was in columns on the road from Molsheim with 2 regiments of cavalry. 2 others were placed in the rear of the 15th Division of Bischheim. Such was the situation of our troops on the morning of the 28th, when the enemy attacked with impetuosity the village of Lampertine, which was occupied by a battalion of the 10th under the command of General Burman. This battalion alone sustained for a long time the attacks of 8,000 infantry and the continued firing of 6 pieces of cannon. However, as the number of the assailants was continually increasing, it withdrew behind the river and, conformably to its orders, stationed itself at Muldelsheim. The enemy's columns, from 40 to 50,000 men strong, advanced immediately by the roads from Brunt to Bischweiler. All these arrangements and the masses of cavalry which covered the first of these rows announced that their project was to separate the divisions of Generals Rotzenberg and Albert in order to overwhelm the latter. I did not mistake the design of the Allies, but I had not the power of uniting my troops, which had deployed in an immense plain and were already engaged throughout the whole line. There only remained one expedient. I adopted it immediately. Fortunately, it was a most fatal one for the enemy. I closed the 10th Regiment into columns in the very midst of the firing. I ordered the 32nd to advance, and I moved it an echelon after having formed it into a square. The rest of the division of Albert remained in reserve on the height of Hinterhausbergen. Defending the ground foot by foot, General Rothenberg changed the front of his division, throwing his left wing into the rear, and proceeded to cover the villages of Hohenheim, Bischheim, and Schittenheim, threatening the flank of the troops which were engaged between these 2 divisions. This was according to his orders. The 103rd was placed on the road from Brunt, and the 36th left Suffelsweiersheim to support it. But scarcely had it begun to march when the Allies attacked the village. I immediately dispatched a company to defend this important position. Our soldiers advanced to it running, but our adversaries had taken possession of it before they could arrive. Captain Chauvin supported with extraordinary courage the fire of a cloud of sharpshooters, and thus gave time for General Friron to come up. This officer left a battalion and 4 pieces of cannon to cover the road and advanced in charging time with the rest of his forces. General Gudin seconded this movement and maneuvered on the road from Bischweiler. The Austrians gave way and withdrew, but the reinforcements which they every moment received left our troops no chance of maintaining their position. On the other hand, the assailants had outflanked the 10th, and the moment had arrived for effecting the movement which I had ordered. Consequently, the 16th Division wheeled back its left wing perpendicularly to the rear, while it preserved the head of Hohenheim, from whence our artillery raked the enemy in flank and rear. At the same time, the gallant General Burman attacked on every side and already surrounded, sallied forth from Mundusheim at the head of the 10th and retreated without disorder towards the division. The Austrians on their side advanced on the road from Brunt with enormous masses of cavalry and infantry supported by formidable artillery. They penetrated between the two divisions and arrived without obstacle of 4 pieces of cannon which had been continually pouring discharges of grape shot on their columns. They were taken, but the enemy presented his flank to the troops of General Ruttenberg and to 2 regiments of cavalry which were on his front. I took advantage of this circumstance, put myself at the head of the 11th Dragoons and the 7th Horse Chasseurs. I made a rapid charge. I routed the first line, penetrated the second, and overthrew everything that offered me any resistance. We made a dreadful slaughter of the Austrian and Württemberg cavalry. At the same time, the 32nd came up at the charge in close columns and prevented them from rallying. They were thrown back on their own infantry, whom they put to flight. General Ruttenberg, on his side, pushed forward his right wing and opened on the enemy, who defiled in confusion before his columns a most destructive fire of artillery and musketry. In an instant, the field of battle is covered with the slain, and the immense army of the Prince of Württemberg is routed. The defeat was so complete that baggage, which was 2 leagues in the rear, was attacked and plundered, and the prince himself lost his equipages. The confusion extended itself as far as Hagenau and would have gone still farther if 30,000 Russians who came up from Weissenberg had not by their presence encouraged the fugitives. The night which came on, and the risk that there would have been in adventuring against forces so superior to our own, prevented us from profiting by our successes. We could not retake artillery. The enemy had made haste to remove it to his rear. It cost him very dear to keep it. He had from 1,500 to 2,000 men killed and still more considerable number wounded. On our side, there were about 700 killed and wounded. Of this number were 2 captains of light cavalry, Favier and Danlau, both wounded in defending their cannon, and Colonel Montagnier, who performed such signal service on this occasion. The enemy's general revenged himself for this defeat by devastation. The day after the battle, he set on fire the village of Süffelweiersheim under pretext that the peasants had fired on his troops. This was not the fact. And the name of the Prince of Württemberg will remain forever sullied by an action which plunged a multitude of families into misery. Whether the vigor with which we had repulsed all their attacks had given them a distaste for making new ones, or from some other motive, our adversaries remained some days without undertaking anything. I took advantage of this repose to provision Strasbourg and to fortify myself in my positions. I also had time to give to all commanders of the places who were under my command the most precise instructions. Meantime, the Allied army continued to increase. Fresh corps arrived every day to swell its numbers. Very soon, 70,000 men deployed before us and pressed us on every side. Flags of truce came one after the other without having any marked object in view. I proposed to the enemy's general a suspension of arms, during which I might send an officer to Paris and receive orders from the government. Prince of Württemberg refused, without, however, renouncing the system of communication that he had adopted. It was about this time that he sent for the pastor of Vendenheim, a respectable man and an excellent patriot. "Are you acquainted," he said to him, "with General Rapp?" "Yes, my lord." "Will you undertake a mission to him?" "Assuredly, if its object is in no respect contrary to the interests of my country." "Well, then go and tell him that if he will deliver up Strasbourg to me for the King of France, wealth and honors shall be showered on him. My lord General Rapp is an Alsatian and consequently a good Frenchman. Never will he consent to dishonor his military career. I consequently beseech your highness to entrust someone else with this message." At these words, the venerable pastor bowed and departed, leaving the prince astonished and confused at having proposed in vain this piece of meanness. Nevertheless, his highness was not discouraged. On the 3rd of June, he dispatched General Vicomte to me with a flag of truce to demand of me, in the name of the King of France, to surrender Strasbourg. In order to inspire more confidence, the Austrian officer wore an enormous white ribbon and the decoration of the lily. I asked him whether he came from the king. He replied that he did not. "Well, then," I said to him, "I will not give up the place till my soldiers shall have eaten the thighs of Austrians, as those I had at Danzig ate those of the Russians." Importuned by the insignificant communications which the commander of the Allied forces was every day sending me, I endeavored to penetrate into his motives. With this object, a general reconnaissance was made on the 6th. on the Austrian positions. Our soldiers took some posts of cavalry, cut others to pieces, and returned to the camp. After having made all the enemy's army get under arms, having heard 2 days after a heavy cannonade in the direction of Pfalzburg, I resolved to make a second reconnaissance as well to make myself precisely acquainted with the forces that I had before me, as to hinder the Prince of Württemberg from detaching troops against that place. Albert's division and the cavalry marched against the entrenched camp, which the Austrians had formed all the way from the strong position of Oberhausbergen to Hinterhausbergen. The attack commenced at 3 o'clock in the morning. It was impetuous and crowned with the most complete success. The enemy's cavalry were repulsed and put to flight by the brigade of General Gruvel. The principal villages were taken at the point of the bayonet, and the entrenchments carried by force. Several officers were taken in their beds, and others at the very moment they were rushing to arms. Some generals escaped in their shirts and owed their safety only to the darkness which protected them. The 10th Light Infantry, commanded by the gallant Colonel Crétet, displayed in this affair the same valor as at the battle of the 28th, the 18th, under the orders of Colonel Fabrel. One of the most intrepid officers of the French army made itself master of the village of Mittelhausbergen, where he withstood for a long time numerous forces and incessant attacks on every point. The signal for retreat having been given, General Albert ordered the 57th to form in echelon towards the attack on the right, and the 32nd towards that on the left. We retired in the best order. The enemy endeavored to disturb us. He attacked our troops. The 57th received him without wavering and opened a fire at musket length, which disorganized his columns. Twice the Allied cavalry returned to the charge. Twice was it repulsed with loss. General Laroche, who led it on, was wounded and fell under the feet of the horses. He would have perished if the French had not come to his assistance. "Friends," cried he, "I once served in your ranks, saved me." He was immediately taken up and restored to his own men. A troop of cuirassiers had nearly surprised the 18th in its retrograde movement, but the chief of the staff, Colonel Schneider, having skillfully opposed to it a battalion that he had by him, broke their shock and saved the regiment from an inevitable defeat. The Allies, convinced that they could not succeed in cutting us off, left us peaceably to continue our march. Our troops returned to their camp after having accurately ascertained the immense superiority of the forces that they had to contend with. Both parties entered into cantonments. A military convention was signed a few days afterwards, and hostilities ceased throughout all of Alsace. Chapter 58. Inactivity soon engendered sedition. Other armies, other corps, which had not the excuse of being misled by a political combination, had trampled underfoot military discipline. Is it strange that, in the midst of the general effervescence, my soldiers should for a moment have forgotten themselves? This episode is painful to me. I ought neither to write it nor omit it. I can well bear the blame which Joubert, Massena, and so many other generals, whom I do not pretend to equal, have incurred. The following are the terms in which this act of disobedience is related by an anonymous writer. He has not thought proper to tell everything, but it is my own conduct that is concerned. I must imitate his reserve. I submit, moreover, to the judgment which he has delivered. The Austrians, despairing of ever getting possession of Strasbourg by force of arms, endeavored to form an understanding with a party of the town. They succeeded by their sagacity in the application of the two means which act the most powerfully on the heart of men: gold and terror. They decoyed some by the attraction of riches. They subdued others by making them dread the vengeance of the government. When they were in this manner assured of all those whom they thought open to seduction, they hastened to execute their perfidious designs. From the commencement of the campaign, our soldiers had been in a state of irritation well calculated to promote the secret views of the enemy. They were acquainted with the disastrous affair of Waterloo. They knew all the details of it. But they had too much confidence in the skill of that celebrated man with whom they had 5 times triumphed over all Europe. They had too often seen him, by sudden inspiration, regain his hold of victory when she was escaping from him, to believe that his military genius had on the sudden abandoned him. They were perpetually thinking of this disaster, and they could never think of it without rage. persuaded as they were that our troops had continued the same, and that they had to do with the same enemy, such a defeat appeared to them inconceivable. Not knowing the true cause of it, they attributed all our misfortunes to treason. Traitors had given intelligence of our plans. Traitors had commanded false maneuvers. Traitors had raised the cry of sauve qui peut. There were traitors among the generals, among the officers, among the soldiers, and who knew whether there were none but in the army of the North? Who knew whether the corps of which they were a part, their regiment, their company, were not infested with them? Could they reckon on their chiefs, on their comrades? Everyone was suspected. It was necessary to distrust everyone. Such was the language in which anger found vent, which malevolence caught up, magnified, envenomed, and which every soldier in the end repeated and believed. This idea soon became the medium through which everything was explained. Accustomed to keep the field, they saw themselves with pain compelled to retreat before an enemy whom they despised. It would have been natural to attribute his progress to an immense numerical superiority. They chose to explain it otherwise. Their chiefs were in correspondence with the Austrians. Several circumstances, as unfortunate as they were unavoidable, concurred to give to this opinion an appearance of probability. In the prejudiced eyes of these soldiers, the first of these was the order which General Rapp received to disband the army and to dismiss each soldier separately, without money and without arms. The next one, an injunction sent to him by the government to deliver to the Russian commissioners 10,000 muskets taken from the arsenal at Strasbourg. These two dispatches obliged him to enter into a correspondence with the Allies. The frequent interchange of messengers which took place on this occasion produced a bad effect on their minds. The mystery which the general was obliged to observe to conceal from the troops the removal of the firearms increased the irritation. Malevolence raised it to its height. It was loudly said that Count Rapp had sold himself, that he had received several millions of francs from the Austrians to introduce them into the fortress, and that if he discharged the soldiers individually and without arms, it was in consequence of an agreement to deliver them up to the enemy. As soon as these seeds of discontent had been once sown in the different corps, they were developed of themselves. The instigators had nothing more to do than to observe their progress, to combine the incidents calculated to augment the disorders, and to render inevitable the catastrophe which they were preparing. Although General Rapp was far from suspecting such a plot, he had taken in some way all the measures that he could take to frustrate it. As soon as the ministerial dispatch relative to the disbanding the troops reached him, he had dispatched with all speed to Paris one of his aides-de-camp, the chief of squadron Marnier. This officer saw the ministers repeatedly and represented to them into what violence the army would be led if the whole amount of the pay due to it was not discharged. But he could not only obtain, notwithstanding the most earnest solicitation, a bill for 400,000 francs on the chest of the War Department. His return with this trifling sum destroyed all the hope that had been excited. The general-in-chief, who saw the troops getting more and more exasperated, left nothing untried to allay the storm. The want of money was the principal cause of dissatisfaction. To put an end to this source of discontent, Count Rapp endeavored to raise a loan in Strasbourg. The inhabitants having demanded of him a security, he solicited from the Minister of Finance authority to pledge the stores of tobacco in the town. The minister refused it. Nevertheless, by the interposition of General Semalet, who commanded such an attempt, then their chiefs, but their determination was taken. They came and ranged themselves in line of battle in the palace yard and demanded to be introduced to the general-in-chief. An aide-de-camp came down to know the purpose which brought them there. They refused to enter into any explanation with him. "Who is the chief of the troop?" asked the officer. "No one. Everyone," they all replied together. He called into the center of the court the oldest of each regiment. He remonstrated with them on the act of disobedience that they were rendering themselves guilty of. 1,000 voices at once interrupted him. "Money! Money! We will be paid what is due us. We know how to get ourselves paid." The chief of the staff, Colonel Schneider, whose courage they had so often admired in the midst of danger, arrived at this conjuncture and endeavored, but with as little success, to quiet them. "Money!" they again repeated. "Money!" Wearied with the uttering Their cries and holding out useless threats and not being able to get the general-in-chief, they dispersed after having fixed on a rendezvous. The greatest part went to the parade, where they immediately proceeded to the election of the new chiefs whom they had determined on having. One of them, called Dalhousie, sergeant of the 7th Light Regiment, well known for his ability, his courage, and particularly his soldier-like oratory, which was peculiar to him, was unanimously elected. "You want to be paid," he said to his comrades, "and it is for this that you are here." "Yes," they replied with a common voice. "Well then, if you will promise to obey me and to abstain from all confusion, to respect property, to protect persons, I swear by my head that you shall be paid within 24 hours. This speech was received with cries of joy, and the sergeant was appointed general. He immediately chose for the chief of the staff the drum major of the 58th. A second sub-officer was charged with the office of governor of the fortress, the third with the command of the 1st Division, another with that of the 2nd, and so on. The regiments had colonels, the battalions and squadrons chiefs, and the company's captains. In short, a complete staff was formed. The other sub-officers had returned to the barracks where the soldiers were waiting with impatience for the result of the step that had been taken. The drum was immediately beat to arms, and all the corps, infantry, cavalry, and artillery marched in order and in double quick time to the parade. The organization was scarcely ended when they arrived there. As soon as they appeared, the new chiefs went and took command and marched the troops to the points they had orders to occupy. In the meantime, General Rapp, astonished to see so serious an insurrection break out, had dressed himself in haste in hopes of ascertaining the motives of these seditious movements and of succeeding in quieting them. But the different operations of which we have just given account had been effected with such celerity that at the moment when he set out, accompanied by his adjutant general and a few officers, several columns, followed by a numerous populace, were already debouching through all the streets leading from the square of the palace. As soon as they perceived the general, the troops hastily put themselves in order of battle and charged bayonets to hinder him from passing. Immediately furious cries were heard in the rear ranks. "Fire! He has sold the army! Fire then!" Some wretches scattered among the troops excited them by their gestures and voices to massacre this brave man. Rage spread from man to man, and confusion was soon at its height. The soldiers, enraged, loaded their muskets. Their ranks were doubled. 8 pieces of cannon arrived at a gallop and were immediately loaded with grape shot. Every time that General Rapp addressed those who menaced him, vociferations commenced and irritating cries were uttered with increased violence. Muskets were repeatedly leveled at him, and the pieces of cannon were constantly directed against his person, and the gunners followed all his movements. "Stand aside," they exclaimed, "that we may fire on him." A howitzer was constantly kept so directly pointed at the group which surrounded the general that he perceived it. He ran to the cannoneer who was holding the match. "Well, what would you do, wretched man?" he said to him. "Do you wish to kill me? Fire then. Here I am at the mouth of your gun." "Ah, General," the soldier exclaimed, letting the match fall from his hand, "I was at the siege of Danzig with you. I would give you my life, but my comrades will be paid, and I am obliged to do as they do." And he resumed his match. Wearied with senseless questions, with appeals without any object, deafened by the clamors of the multitude, the mass of which was continually increasing, the general decided at last on returning to the palace. The troops followed him, and the different avenues were immediately occupied by 8 pieces of cannon, 1,000 infantry, and a squadron of cavalry. This guard called itself the exterior guard of the palace. A battalion came and established itself in the court and took the name of interior guard. Nearly 60 sentinels were placed in pairs at all the gates and on the staircase which led to the apartment of Count Rapp. There were also some for a few moments at the door of his bedchamber. The telegraph and the mint were immediately taken possession of. To show that they had no bad designs, a detachment was sent to the hotel of the Austrian General Volkmann, who was in the place and was put at his disposal. The drawbridges were raised, and there was no communication with anyone out of the fortress without a permission signed by the new commander. The drum major of the 58th repaired with the trumpet to the headquarters of the Allies and signified to them that if they respected the truce, the garrison would not commit any act of hostility, but that if they endeavored to take advantage of the misunderstanding which existed between the chief and the soldiers, it would know how to oppose a noble resistance. Meanwhile, Dalhousie had established his staff at the parade and had appointed 2 commissions, the one for the provisions composed of quartermaster sergeants and the other for the finances composed of sergeant majors. They constituted themselves permanent, deliberated on the measures best calculated to maintain the public tranquility and to put the town in a state of security against surprise. The posts of the citadel and those of the interior were doubled. Guards were even placed in some old posterns, which till then had been neglected. The outer line was strengthened, the troops bivouacked in the square, and in the streets, in fact, no precaution was omitted, which the most suspicious prudence could suggest, in order to prevent the excesses to which malevolence might excite the soldiers. It was forbidden, under pain of death, to enter any of the places where brandy, wine, or beer was sold. The same punishment was denounced against all who should be guilty of plunder, riot, or insubordination. Lastly, still better to secure the public tranquility, it was resolved that the army should be informed of its situation every 6 hours. These arrangements having been made, the receiver general and the inspector of reviews were sent for. The latter made a calculation of the sums necessary for the present year's pay. The other presented the account of what he had in the chest, after which the Luzi convoked the town council, to whom he declared the motives which had made the garrison take arms, and requested the mayor to take means to get funds necessary to pay the arrears. He then dispatched to Count Rapp a deputation composed of the new governor and of 5 or 6 general sergeants. "Well, what do you want of me again?" cried the general in a tone of indignation and contempt. "You are unworthy to wear the French uniform. I believed that you were men of honor. I am deceived. You allowed yourselves to be seduced by wretches. What do you wish to do? Why do these guards surround the palace? Why is this artillery pointed against me? Am I then so formidable? Is it believed that I wish to escape? Why should I escape? I fear nothing. I do not fear you. But to the point, what do you want of me?" He repeated this question. The agitation of Count Rapp while pronouncing these words was a striking contrast to the melancholy air of the deputation. These sub-officers, ashamed of keeping a chief whom they loved and whose valor and fidelity were so well known to them, a prisoner, kept a profound silence. They were on the point of withdrawing when one of them spoke. "General," he said, "we have learned that the other corps of the army have been paid. Our soldiers also are resolved to be paid. They are in a state of revolt, but they obey us. We only ask what is due to us, the slight indemnification for so much blood and so many wounds. We only ask for what is indispensable to enable us to perform our march and withdraw to our homes. The troops will not return to order. It is a thing firmly resolved on until everyone be paid." "There is not enough money in the chest," replied the general. "It was my intention to have you paid, stoppages and all. I dispatched an aide-de-camp to Paris. He sought the ministers, but they could only give him 400,000 francs. It is this sum, together with that in the chest of the paymaster, which I will order to be divided among the different regiments. The army will be paid, my general. I have told you all that I have to say to you. Withdraw and return as soon as possible to order. If the enemy unfortunately should be acquainted with what is going on here, what will become of you? All this has been foreseen, my general. A regiment of cavalry and 12 pieces of cannon have set out to reinforce the division which is at the camp. It is easy for you to get us paid, and you have everything to fear on the part of the soldiers if in 24 hours from this time their request is not complied with. What is it to me what you and your soldiers may do? I repeat that you shall only have the funds which are destined for you. Do not hope that whatever happens, you can compel me to do what my duty prohibits. General, the soldiers can conduct you to the citadel. They can even shoot you. We answer for them now. But if you do not cause us to be paid, I have nothing more to say to you. Quit my house. If you shoot me, so be it. I prefer death to shame. You are the enemies of order. You are the instruments of malevolence and of a conspiracy which you yourselves are not acquainted with. The enemy perhaps is in concert. I make you responsible for everything that may happen. You have heard me. Be gone. I am ashamed to converse with rebels." The word conspiracy made a very deep impression upon them. They remained silent for some time. They began again, however, and one of them said that if there were among them anyone who had secret intentions, they were ignorant of it. That for themselves, they only wanted their pay, but that paid they would be, and that they were going to bring to him the civil authorities in order that he might give directions for raising the funds. after which they withdrew. Whilst the council was consulting on the means of securing public tranquility and of liquidating the pay in arrear, the army had effected different movements. It had marched and countermarched, always at a running pace, without uttering a word, without venting a threat against the officers whom it had put under arrest. This silence, rather extraordinary for French soldiers, had something sinister about it, which the inhabitants were alarmed. Nevertheless, the troops at last became calm, but they held no communication with the townspeople. They even refused to answer their questions. In the streets, in the squares, groups were continually seen forming, which dispersed after they had communicated in a very low tone, either orders or opinions. The whole town was plunged in melancholy disquietude. Fatal epics were recalled to their recollection. They feared to see them revive. Everyone trembled for his property, for his life. Never was there a more terrifying scene than that which this large city then presented. The general-in-chief, having learned that the afternoon a horse-chasseur arrived at full gallop on the parade, announcing that 3 wagons full of gold had just been stopped, belonging to General Rapp, who was sending them out of the city under the protection of the Austrians. These 3 wagons, he added, have been taken to the covered bridge. And here's the receipt I am bearing to our commander-in-chief. General Rapp must be shot. He's a traitor. He has sold us to the enemy. Whatever irritation still remained, this speech produced little effect. The troops used their chief roughly to compel him to levy contributions, but they did not entertain any suspicion against him. His reputation as a man of honor remained unblemished, and his integrity was no more doubted by them than his courage. Such open provocations to murder excited distrust, and the soldiers became more circumspect. Some, however, propagated alarms and wished that his person should be secured, but the army had the good sense to repel suggestions, the complete perfidiousness of which it did not perhaps at first perceive. As soon as one expedient failed, the conspirators attempted another and left nothing untried to spill blood, persuaded that if it had once flowed, it would be easy to make it flow again. The general's coachman was driving from the palace to the stables a cart laden with straw. The sentinels made some objections to allow it to pass. It, however, went on, but scarcely was it out when some ill-disposed persons cried, "Treason!" and pretended that under the pretext of removing straw, the military chest was carried off. Immediately, the multitude rushed on the cart and on its load in order to search it the better. Nothing was found. They loaded it again, demanding nevertheless that it should go back. The horses took fright, set off, and ran over a child. At this sight, fury redoubled. The guard were formed. The multitude rushed tumultuously into the court of the palace, seized the coachman, and massacred him without pity in the hands of an officer who had come forth to defend him. The disorder was not meant to stop at the death of a servant, but groups of soldiers came up, forced the most infuriated to restrain themselves, and thus the blow once more failed. All the attempts to get General Rapp massacred by the hands of his troops having failed, recourse was had to extraordinary means of assassinating him. As soon as night was come, a multitude of individuals succeeded each other and used force to introduce themselves into his bedchamber. But the aides-de-camp and some officers defended the door with courage and preserved their chief from insult. In the midst of this effervescence, an event suddenly happened to cool the soldiery and contributed to restore them to order. The enemy's line drew its cantonments closer round the town at the very moment the insurrection broke out, and also received considerable reinforcements. This coincidence of the measures adopted by the Austrians with an event which they ought not to have been acquainted with gave much room for conjecture. Thus the outer division immediately doubled their main guards. Fresh troops and artillery came from the town. The enemy, intimidated, durst not make any attempt. Perhaps he was also awaiting the result of the plots which he had framed in Strasbourg. Perhaps he feared to enter into an engagement with an army so much the more formidable, as it had put itself under the necessity of conquering, and as it continued, for all that related to the military engagements, to receive its orders from General Rottenburg, whose courage and skill the Austrians had experienced more than once during this campaign. The enemy, therefore, remained in position and appeared to be waiting till the favorable moment should arrive. On its side, the army was on its guard against the tricks prepared for it and pursued with calmness and firmness the only end which it had in view, the discharge of the pay in arrear. General Garrison redoubled his vigilance to preserve public tranquility and went forth, attended by his staff, all dressed in their uniform and on horseback, to secure the execution of his orders. As soon as he appeared, the drums beat to arms. The guard were turned out and rendered him all the honors due to the commander-in-chief. Thus Strasbourg presented the appearance of the most perfect order in the midst of disorder, and the most severe discipline reigned in an army in a state of revolt. The loan having been raised, the pay officers, according to the numerical order of the regiments, were conducted under a good escort to the paymaster general, where they received the sums necessary for the pay of their corps, but they were enjoined not to make any individual payments until all the regiments should have received what was owing to them. Thus passed the first day. There was less agitation on the second. Still, there was an attempt to make the troops believe some rumors calculated to produce disturbance, but little attention was paid to them. Towards evening, the orders given to the sentinels of the palace became less strict. The aides de camp had leave to go out under escort. A file of grenadiers was appointed to escort them where they wished and to conduct them back again. During the night, the posts were all renewed. Individuals in the uniform of sub-officers presented themselves once more to penetrate into the general's apartments, to satisfy themselves, as they said, that he had not escaped. The altercations between them and the officers of the staff were warmer than ever. The latter, nevertheless, in the end prevailed. In fine, the division of the funds was effected towards 9 o'clock in the morning. Immediately the call to arms was sounded. The army assembled, withdrew its posts, raised the siege of the palace, and repaired to the parade. General Garrison, accompanied by all his staff, drew up the troops in line and addressed it to them the following proclamation. We give it verbatim. Soldiers of the Army of the Rhine, the bold step which has just been taken by your sub-officers to obtain justice and the complete discharge of your pay has compromised them with the civil and military authorities. It is in your good conduct, your resignation, and your excellent discipline that they hope to find safety. That which you have maintained up to the present time is the best guarantee of it, and of this they hope for a continuous soldier. The pay officers have in their possession all that is owing to you. The garrison will return to its former situation. The posts will remain till the general-in-chief shall have given offers in consequence. On their return from the parade, the sergeant majors and the quartermasters shall repair to their pay officers and shall take note before paying the troops of messieurs the colonels in order to keep back what is not due. The infantry is to be disbanded. It will take superior orders, and the cavalry, still having no order, will wait its lot in order to give up, at least before setting off, the horses, arms, and all that belongs to the government, in order that it may be said that they are Frenchmen. They have served with honor. They have obtained payment of what was due to them, and have submitted to the orders of the king under the glorious title of the Army of the Rhine. By order of the Army of the Rhine.